I can remember 1989 almost as if it were last week. It was such a vivid experience. And those of us who were watching it, particularly those who'd been involved with the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe for any length of time, were just in a state of shock.
Most people thought somehow the Soviet Union would last forever, even into the 1980s. And it's interesting to remember that, the Reagan administration, the early 1980s, this was a period in America of a renewed anti-communism and this belief that this was a nation that would survive and that we had to be very vigilant.
And so the hope was now the Soviet Union would join in, or at least the successor states of the Soviet Union would join in, become global, and become what Mikhail Gorbachev called a normal country, or a normal civilized country. It was used to refer to them as the civilized nations. And it would become more democratic, that it would have an economy which actually produced things for the benefit of its people, and that it would become a partner in global developments rather than an antagonist.
What a lot of Russians used to say is, we just want to have a normal life, meaning the ability to travel freely, to read what they wanted to read, to be able to have access to any sources of information that weren't censored, to be able to buy in the stores anything they wanted to buy, to not have to stand in line for bread and milk and the basic necessities of life. This is what they all would say. We want to have чтобы мы жили нормально. And I think that was what they were hoping for.
So at the time it was a very exciting event. However, as time went on, it became clear that the unfreezing, if you like, of the Cold War and the fall of the war was unleashing a whole set of processes that we hadn't even guessed at.
The whole safety net that Russians, Czechs, Hungarians, but especially Russians, the safety net that they had taken for granted their entire lives, free healthcare, free education, a job, rent that was nearly free, all of this just disappeared in a matter of months. So it was really very frightening for a lot of people. For many Russians, this was a profoundly tragic moment. This loss of power, authority, solidity, feeling of confidence, really, about themselves and their place in the world.
There's always a great deal of mistrust of the outside world. Russia is, after all, a huge country. It's a sixth or a seventh of the world's land surface, and yet it has this huge border that's very difficult to protect, and a small population bunched up essentially in one part of the country. So they've always had this sense that the world is a dangerous place and that foreigners are not to be trusted. One hoped that at the end of the 20th century they would have gotten over this and that they would have been more trusting and more willing to embrace the outside world. And for a while they did, or at least they tried to. But then, over the last 10 years or so, there's been a gradual slide back into their old patterns.
The 90s, although they were on the one hand a really terrible period in Russia, economic collapse, a lot of poverty, a lot of misfortune, at the same time it was a period of real democracy. And, the Yeltsin period, where you had real free media. You had a lot of newspapers and television stations and a real experience, especially in information, democratic system. And that has pretty much disappeared during the Putin era.
We are at a time where there are a number of possibilities. I think that in spite of the return to authoritarianism and the dismantling, essentially, of the democratic system that Gorbachev started to put in place, in spite of that, I think that Russia is sufficiently now a different place that there are people there, groups and strata, that will be willing to fight for something more civilized, if you like, freer, with more respect for human rights, more real democracy.
There's no question that Russia's global status has greatly shrunk. And I think unless there's some very serious attempt to deal with some of the fundamental problems, health care and other things in Russia, that is going to continue to happen.
The people on the outside, the American administration and everybody else, have to have policies regarding Russia. And unless you can figure out where they're going, it's very hard to know whether or not you should have a policy of accommodation or a policy of cooperation, or one which is more suspicious and sort of keeps them at a distance.
Unless Putin and the Russian government can figure out ways to deal with some of these problems, I think the influence of Russia will continue to decline in the world.
So this is an interesting time. Where they're going clearly is an unknown, and where we're going because of that is also an unknown. And this is the dilemma, I think, that leaders around the world who have to deal with Russia, whether they like it or not, face.